Thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Susan, thank you so much for the invitation. Wow, the Einstein Forum. I remember looking at and seeing the scholarship, but I've slightly aged out of the the range there, much to my sadness. But today, I want to ask a couple of questions. What did it mean to be an enlightened liberal in the United States before the 20th century? And what's race got to do with it? Since the founding of the United States, prominent thinkers associated with the early American liberal tradition, from Thomas Jefferson to Frederick Douglass, debated the efficacy of liberal and Enlightenment ideas of individual rights, human equality, moral universalism, and progress. They did not necessarily endorse liberalism in the sense now commonly equated with atomistic individualism and unfettered free markets that ignore the collective good. Instead, they frequently contrasted their liberal commitments with contemptuous characterizations of feudalism. My forthcoming book, American Dark Age, reconstructs their view of liberal ideas by shedding light on how they understood feudalism, its ideological antithesis. Today, I'll illuminate the central claims. Hopefully you can see that. Today, I'll illuminate the central claims by examining the longstanding dominance of racial feudalism in America since the 18th century in part one of my talk. Part two, I will examine the equal and opposite defiance of early Black liberals during the 19th century, and I'll look at the lasting durability of Black liberal ideas for politics in the 21st century in part three. Parts one and two are heavy on intellectual history, so if you prefer contemporary philosophy, please hang in there until I get to part three. Part one, section A, what was feudalism? During the 1700s, the founding generation was abuzz with condemnations of feudalism and feudal law. Luminaries such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Noah Webster, and Thomas Paine attacked purported atavisms of feudalism in Europe and the fledgling United States. Indeed, Jefferson gained political prominence during the Revolutionary era as author of a 1774 document that conspicuously criticized the feudal tenures, the feudal burdens, and the family of princes that dominated Britain's past, as he contextualized the political overreaches of King George III and the British Parliament. Shortly after America declared independence in 1776, Jefferson authored economic legislation in the Virginia House of Delegates against practices of primogeniture and entail that, in his view, abolished the, quote, feudal and unnatural distinctions still present in Virginia. Jefferson praised this and other 18th century laws he wrote as, quote, forming a system by which every fiber would be eradicated of ancient or future aristocracy and a foundation laid for a government truly Republican. As it comes, though Jefferson celebrated the abolition of feudalism, what he saw as the imposition of social, political, and religious hierarchy following the Norman conquest of England that ended Anglo-Saxon rule, he was not completely free of sympathies for medieval times and took great interest in the history of England prior to 1066. In John Adams' telling, Jefferson even wanted America's national seal to feature an image of, I'll show you here, Hengst and Horsa, the medieval Anglo-Saxon chiefs. In any case, for Jefferson and for other founders, notions of medieval feudalism, such as vassalage, serfdom, homage, crusades, and dark ages, often signaled related concepts. And those include artificial hierarchies, arbitrary violations of natural rights and freedoms, outlined in the Declaration of Independence and codified in the US Constitution, what I take to be the foundational Enlightenment documents of the American tradition. And three, abuses of political power perpetuated by a tyrannical governing authority. Part 1, Section B. What was racial feudalism? Despite Jefferson's celebratory claims about removing the final vestiges of feudalism, African Americans continued to face artificial hierarchies preserved by slavery in the South and prejudice in the North. In researching their reactions to these conditions, I found that many prominent Black abolitionists, in line with the patriots of the founding era, drew on feudal metaphors to characterize the conditions of their subjection. However, unlike Jefferson and the other founders, Black Americans throughout the 19th century described their perception of feudal vestiges on U.S. soil in relation to a racial hierarchy rooted in the humiliations of paternalism, asymmetric notions of mutual obligation, and false claims of a natural pecking order that spuriously relegated Black people to the bottom. The language they used and the illiberal ideology it unmasked represents what I call racial feudalism. In 1827, for example, a Black minister named Nathaniel Paul questioned the integrity of America's founding ideas while there were, quote, no less than 1,500,000 human beings still in the state of unconditional vassalage. And a vassal is a subordinate tenant in the feudal system that owes homage and allegiance to a superior lord. 10 years later, African-American philosopher Hosea Easton contended that the U.S. racial hierarchy emerged after, quote, European slavery under the feudal system, where slaves were fixed to the soil. George M. Horton confirmed this suspicion in an 1845 poem entitled The Division of an Estate, where he similarly portrays enslaved people tending a sprawling plantation under foreclosure as, quote, poor vassals. 2 years later, the fugitive slave and author of the first Black American novel, William Wells Brown, wondered aloud, shall the American people be behind the people of the old world? Shall they be behind those who were represented as almost living in the dark ages? For him, racial slavery, quote, had given the serfs of the old world an opportunity of branding the American people the most tyrannical people on God's footstool. Also in 1847, in a speech to an audience in Coventry, England, Frederick Douglass, perhaps the most famous abolitionist in U.S. history, took great pains to describe, quote, a skin aristocracy in America. No, not exactly the skin. It was the color of the skin. That was the mark and distinction, or the brand of degradation. Douglass later told his Boston audience, quote, I could have easily stayed in England if I had sought for ease, undisturbed and unannoyed by American skin aristocracy. Likewise, he compared the conditions Black people faced in the United States during the 1850s to, quote, all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world. He even likened his Maryland plantation to, quote, what the baronial domains were during the Middle Ages in Europe. Underscoring this notion, John Mercer Langston, the first Black U.S. congressional representative from Virginia, would claim shortly after the post-Civil War Reconstruction era that, quote, the tendency of political thought in the U.S. South has always been towards aristocracy and feudal institutions, the right of a few to govern, the right being founded upon wealth, landed estates, and consequent social positions and influence. Meanwhile, during the antebellum era, Black Americans also equated the U.S. military's treatment of Native peoples and Mexicans to medieval campaigns. Hosea Easton, for example, resoundingly condemned the, quote, late unholy war with the Indians and the wicked crusade against the peace of Mexico. Along these lines, African-American abolitionist Martin Delany excoriated the future U.S. President Zachary Taylor in an 1849 letter to Frederick Douglass. Denouncing Taylor's supporters, he writes, quote, the extent to which the American people carry this glorification of military crusaders is beyond a parallel. The extent to which this homage is carried ceases to be respectful, since it is neither kind nor complimentary, but like the homage of the serf to the noble or the vassal to his lord. It's ludicrous. Part 1, Section C, Racial Feudalism and Pro-Slavery Thought. Contrary to Black abolitionists' damning critiques of feudalism and its associated concepts during the first half of the 19th century, many white pro-slavery thinkers from that period celebrated what historian and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois assailed as, quote, American feudalism. From the halls of Congress and state legislatures to the lecture stages in colleges and the pages of agricultural journals, they lobbied for legislation and supported institutions that would attempt to recreate, in law and culture, a society that mirrored their fantasies of a feudal past, with Black people now serving as the peasants of the lowest caste. They consciously deployed the nostalgic language of feudalism as a political smokescreen to obscure their moves to consolidate the social, political, and economic power that would sustain their elevated position in their collective racial ascendancy. Charles Pinckney, for example, a Southern politician and slaveholder who signed the U.S. Constitution, became governor of South Carolina, and served in both chambers of U.S. Congress, he exemplifies this. During the 1787 Constitutional Convention, he moved to have enslaved Black people count toward the South's voting power without giving them the ability to vote, claiming that, quote, the Blacks are the laborers, the peasants of the Southern states. Pinckney implies that though Black people could not vote, they were conscripted into a paternalistic system of representation, which he saw as reminiscent of old world forms of power, wherein lords effectively spoke for the peasants of their land. Pinckney's choice of language is telling. The late Middle English term peasant, beyond representing a worker of the land, implies a serf, a bonded laborer or servant. In 1836, U.S. Representative James Henry Hammond bellowed in the halls of U.S. Congress that American slavery retained the advantages of the aristocracy of the old world. He claimed that, quote, slavery does indeed create an aristocracy of talents, of virtue, of generosity, and courage. In a slave country, every free man is an aristocrat. In 1854, George Fitzhugh, a pro-slavery Southern ideologue, echoed associations that many slavery supporters were making between European feudalism and American slavery, writing, quote, look to the old patriarchs and their slaves, to the feudal lords and their vassals, or come to the South and see our farms. Several years later, pro-slavery advocate J. Quitman Moore wrote an article in the widely circulated Southern periodical, the Du Bois Review, entitled Feudalism in America, which ironically questions, quote, the feudal spirit that if the feudal spirit will ever be revived on the Western continent again. Even so, Moore writes that, quote, feudalism is a social and political authority founded upon the subjugation of a weaker by a more powerful race. He contends, quote, Southern society revived the genius of medieval civilization and even surpassed it because of the new racial science in the 19th century. In other words, the U.S. South had successfully extended and improved the philosophy, to his mind, of medieval society through the study of racial difference and the imposition of racial hierarchy. It reimagined the old world feudal order as racial feudalism in America. Part 2, the defiance of Black liberalism. Now that I have accounted for the prevalence of the ideology of racial feudalism across the antebellum United States from the perspective of enslaved people and their enslavers, I'll describe 4 ways in which Black Enlightenment liberals worked to contravene this ideology throughout the antebellum era during the 19th century. Finally, I'll briefly examine how Black liberals writing before the Civil War would respond to various modern critics of the Enlightenment. But first, let me take a step back. In the history of American political thought, Thomas Jefferson is perhaps the most celebrated for distilling the American Enlightenment liberal tradition in the Declaration of Independence that he drafted, which levied potent critiques against British monarchy and its alleged illiberal tyrannical rule of American colonists. Summarizing his longstanding criticisms, Jefferson penned a letter to George Washington in 1791, where he claimed, quote, "I certainly never made a secret of my being anti-monarchical and anti-aristocratical." Though Jefferson trumpeted his rejection of the artificial aristocracy of the old world order because it created feudal and unnatural distinctions, he remained committed to perpetuating a, quote, "natural aristocracy of virtue and talent" in the United States. However, within this framework, Jefferson maintained doubts that the natural intellectual capabilities of Black people, which would necessarily he thought that they would necessarily deny them entry into his ruling class of the virtuous and the talented. The patent tensions among race, liberty, and governance in Jefferson's Enlightenment-era writings allowed his uncertainty regarding race to be read as a tacit license to conflate the promotion of a natural aristocracy of virtue and talent in America, on the one hand, with an exclusionary racial aristocracy limited to people with white skin on the other. Indeed, in Jefferson's wake, many of the prominent U.S. statesmen openly advocated for a natural aristocracy tied to the conditions of permanent racial hierarchy through direct or oblique reference to Jefferson's writings, including Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, U.S. Vice President and Senator John C. Calhoun, and U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. However, many Black Americans worked to renovate and expand the meaning of Enlightenment ideas in the United States by drawing on intellectual traditions with deep roots in the Enlightenment era, and that spawned further movements: utilitarianism, classical liberalism, reform liberalism, and so forth. In the midst of the Civil War, the Pacific Appeal, a California-based African-American newspaper, published a column tellingly entitled "Equitable Laws, or the Practical Results of Legislating the Principle of the Greatest Good for the Greatest Number." Praising the truly democratic principles of a liberal approach rooted in a type of utilitarian moral frame, the colonists hailed the, quote, "more liberal and equitable views that had begun to supersede the despotic reign of slave power." Meanwhile, thinkers such as James McCune Smith advocated for Enlightenment ideas in other ways. A close friend of Frederick Douglass, McCune Smith was America's first Black medical degree holder following his overseas study at the University of Glasgow, the same institution that trained Adam Smith, of course. As a student of the Scottish Enlightenment, a proponent of liberalism, and a fierce critic of racial hierarchy, McCune Smith aimed to destroy the ideology of racial feudalism in the United States by ending slavery and then, as he puts it, quote, "over its grave, producing a pure republic." In this way, he claimed, quote, "we will save the Republican form of government and convert it into a substance." Echoing the sentiment, Frederick Douglass declared in an 1857 speech that Britain's decision to abolish slavery throughout the West Indian colonies could only be interpreted, quote, "through the light of a liberal philosophy." Additionally, Black American liberals underscored the importance of fostering a government in which everyone, including women, could participate through universal suffrage, thus ending the persistence of what Douglass labeled aristocratic rule. Liberal ideas for them were not definitionally synonymous with the laissez-faire economic policy that Karl Marx and other socialists have attributed to which they have been attributed to be describing as the excesses of capitalism. Rather, many Black American liberals were more ideologically aligned with their white counterparts who declared America's early constitutional frameworks, quote, "the most liberal in the world," with the crucial caveat that, as one writer put it in 1781, it was glaringly inconsistent on issues regarding slavery and prejudice. I'll now briefly point out how a variety of other Black thinkers were taking up, elaborating, and transforming liberal discourse since the opening decades of the 19th century by constellating their attitudes and actions around four principles. But the book will take up 6 of them. Oops. The first principle. As most of this talk has emphasized, the political philosophy of Black American liberalism was anti-feudal, anti-prejudice, and deeply committed to the advancement of women's rights, including the right to vote. Though European and American liberal thinkers since the late 18th century mainly rejected feudal hierarchies, many have been accused of eliding questions of race or gender, questions which Black American liberals during the antebellum era explicitly confronted. We see this in the writings of Frederick Douglass, always advocating on behalf of women, but he also expressed a very pragmatic approach to how rights and liberties could actually get through the complicated political scene in the United States. Okay, second principle. Because of their stated commitment to realizing the aims and claims of America's founding documents, most Black American liberals remained anti-colonizationist. That is, they opposed the various schemes promoting the involuntary and thus illiberal expulsion of Black people from the United States, a nation they saw as their home. So in the late 1810s, the American Colonization Society formed, so just got to find a way to get these Black people out of here. They attempted various schemes. And many of these Black liberal thinkers said, no, America is just as much ours as it is yours, and I'm going to draw on the Enlightenment promises and demonstrate through immanent critique how the version of Enlightenment that actually worked to exclude them is insufficient. Okay, so they chose to remain in place and strive to make the United States live up to its stated precepts, even if it meant subjecting the nation to critique and themselves to danger. Importantly, most Black American liberals differed in philosophy from Black separatists, such as Alexander Crummell, because they largely saw the United States as fundamentally infused with the philosophy of freedom that they could bring to its full realization. They had what Frederick Douglass once called, quote, sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that a Black person can ever get justice on American soil. Third principle. As mentioned, the practical philosophy of Black American liberals balanced tenets of reform liberalism and aspects of classical liberalism. It operated through the immanent critique of the existing order rather than assuming the need of its wholesale destruction. Sketching out this position, the former slave William Wells Brown argued that America must be made to realize its, quote, not quite accomplished principles of liberty, reform, and progression. For Black liberals more broadly, achieving progression in a sense that presumed the contingency rather than the inevitability of future improvement required, first, securing liberty through political reforms, and second, self-improvement through intellectual and spiritual development. All of this is not to say that Black reformers rejected the idea of staging a political revolution when necessary to abolish entrenched systemic evils. Douglass, for example, recognized the need for such a break from the existing order to abolish slavery and extend the benefits of the liberal project to all. He welcomed the Civil War as an abolition war that would guarantee liberty for all and chains for none. Fourth principle and final principle. Political transformation through moral improvement. Black American liberals understood their political outlook as compatible with Enlightenment principles consistent with Christian spiritual and moral teachings. Indeed, Black abolitionists such as Harper, Jacobs, and Douglass condemned slavery's fundamentally illiberal architecture by presenting the institution as the limit case for notions of Christianity and moral universalism. Though early Black liberals permitted toleration and did not stipulate that the public must share their religious faith to abolish slavery, they believed that transforming America's racially coded statutes and customs could only be brought about through the moral advancement of the nation and its people. Without moral transformation, political changes to laws or leaders would be impermanent and thus vulnerable to retrogression. All right. I'm going to do a quick, there you go. Okay, we're back. Okay. I'm going to do a quick aside here to talk about Enlightenment liberalism and its critics from the perspective of many of these Black American thinkers. So 20th century readers who are critical of liberalism would likely find the attachment to any liberal project, especially by antebellum Black thinkers, as vexing. W.B. Du Bois, for example, described liberalism more broadly as an illusory system of ideas purporting to portray universal values, even as those values, in his view, serve as a veneer to hide a social, political, and economic order that continues to serve the interests of white property-owning men. Later, Charles Mills, who I'll return to shortly, forcefully criticized Douglass for failing to see what Mills believed to be the inherent and foundational racialization in Western Enlightenment frameworks. However, I would argue that Douglass and other early Black liberal thinkers were more than mere conscripts of illusions embedded in traditional American liberalism. Indeed, they were working to correct the limitations of Enlightenment liberalism from within an Enlightenment framework. To do this, they produced and validated local forms of knowledge that had universalist implications. They engaged in the co-articulation of faith and reason in ways that did not necessarily foreclose religious knowledge from their broader worldview. And they pointed to residual elements of racial feudal ideology within America's liberal framework as the true culprit of what critics of the Enlightenment and liberalism understood to be baked in the tradition itself. Methodologically, the constellation of ideas forming Black American liberalism offers what Adorno elsewhere identifies as an eminent critique of the texts and institutions subtending variations of liberalism. Examples abound of African Americans explicitly taking up this approach, like taking the idea and then boring it from the outside in. Hosea Easton, for example, pushed his fellow Americans in 1837 to resolve the United States' conflict between the actual and the normative, so that it could live up to its potential in an egalitarian and just interracial polity. A quarter century later, Frederick Douglass reaffirmed Easton's call in soaring poetic language that signaled his own commitment to employing a type of eminent critique of the American political tradition. He proclaimed that, quote, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this is the ability, and this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be by reflection of what is, and endeavor to remove the contradiction. Within this framing, an amended liberal social order must emerge by reflecting on the present socio-political reality, what is, while at the same time imagining the possibilities of a new future, what ought to be. This future is not preordained in a Hegelian theological sense, but it is contingent on and conditioned through the dynamic process of struggling to remove the contradiction. And their efforts were aided by the four principles that I mentioned. Okay, final part 3, the durability of Black liberalism. So part 1 of the talk described racial feudalism as a dominant framework in antebellum America. In part 2, I outlined some key tenets of the Black American Enlightenment liberals, including their anti-colonizationist belief, their reformist practical philosophy, and their dedication to moral improvement to sustain political change. I also previewed the method of eminent critique that Black liberals use to test and expand the assumptions and presuppositions of liberalism as it came into practice in the United States. In this final part, I'm going to zoom in on one idea by Frederick Douglass that points to the present-day applicability of the 19th century Black American Enlightenment liberal tradition. I hold that Douglass and his fellow Black liberals did not recognize the circumstances of oppression that Black people faced as evidence of unfreedom at the core of American Enlightenment ideas. They also did not call for the dissolution of the United States, nor for the dismantling of its founding principles. On the contrary, they advanced variations of liberalism that, in their view, could practically overcome the vestiges of feudalism. So to bring their insights up to the 21st century, and to fulfill my promise of talking about contemporary philosophy for those of you who have grown tired of all the intellectual history, I'll now examine three approaches to balancing competing interests in a liberal democracy, comprised of individuals with commitments to various group identities. In doing so, I resist the identity-blind and identity-driven liberal positions, and drawing on Frederick Douglass, I'll champion what I call identity awareness. An identity-blind, or ID-blind approach, which holds that racial or gender considerations should have no place in public policy decisions, can ignore or minimize historical forces that distinctively shape the experience of people in various groups. An identity-driven approach, which sees foregrounding the needs of one's own identity group, as a Black person, say, or a woman, as central to effective policy creation, tends to view the world through a lens that can obscure the importance of coalitions that cut across multiple group experiences. The identity-aware approach that I advance recognizes the impact of historical forces on group identity and finds ways to link individuals to broad-based alliances in a manner that Douglass had practiced and championed. It seeks to create a space for discussing differences without valorizing or trivializing group identity in ways that can oversimplify its manifest content. So I'll detail each of these approaches in turn. All right. The identity-blind approach is usually associated with the philosophy of liberalism and thinkers such as John Rawls. Philosopher Charles Mills and others have criticized identity-blind frameworks as being insufficient because they fail to take into account the history of group discrimination, such as racism and patriarchy. In Mills's view, this results in the false perception that everyone begins at an equal starting point. Opponents of identity-blind frameworks believe that their inherent failure to acknowledge race and racial difference leads to an inability to recognize racism and its pernicious effects. These effects, in their view, require corrective measures. On the other hand, identity-driven approaches are supported by some, though certainly not all, proponents of standpoint epistemology, specifically those who hold that oppressed people have privileged access to knowledge, a claim that has some validity. However, the most extreme position of such a belief would assert that one's identity as a Black person, a woman, a queer person, for example, gives them unique access to knowledge that is not visible to other groups. Such an approach would reject the possibility of mutual intelligibility and claim, quote, "Because you are not my identity, you can't understand our struggle." Philosopher Liddell Dror has critiqued those holding this more hardlined approach to standpoint epistemology. He argues that to accept the premise that some things about oppression cannot be known outside of particular groups is to exculpate people in dominant groups who can then claim ignorance of their misdeeds because they simply cannot understand the perspective of the marginalized. A different but related manifestation of this identity-driven approach can be found among those who believe that resources must be allocated exclusively to a particular group in order to overcome the ways in which historically unjust policies and practices have negatively impacted that group. Given the scarcity of resources and the broad range of voters with varied and competing interests in a given democratic system, identity-driven approaches, despite the validity of their corrective intent, can run into some practical issues that we have to reckon with. Which historical injustices should be privileged? When? To what extent should a group receive preferential access to resources, and for how long? A classic example of this identity-driven approach is the call for federal financial reparations for slavery in the United States. Achieving some form of reparations appeals to most Black Americans, around 77%. But reparations calls have been met with resistance from Americans more broadly. In fact, nearly 70% of all Americans, including potential coalition allies such as Hispanic and Asian voters, immigrants, and poor white voters, oppose reparations for the descendants of enslaved people. Philosopher Derek Darby has shown in his critique of Charles Mills that raising what Darby calls the race-first flag by proposing solutions such as group-specific reparations can alienate possible allies whose votes would be needed to advance such policies on the federal level. In Darby's view, promoting a broader anti-poverty or anti-exploitation agenda would create a big tent coalition whose goals would have a greater chance of achieving political success in a racially divided society. So that's identity blind and identity driven. So to avoid the pitfalls of identity blind and identity driven strategies, I read Dror's critique of hardline versions of standpoint epistemology and Darby's criticism of race-first solutions in concert with Frederick Douglass's antebellum era political theorizing. Douglass's 3 autobiographies took identity seriously while, at the same time, maintaining the necessity of appealing to diverse audiences and affirming the promotion of broad principles for practical political purposes. In this way, he offers what I call an identity-aware solution. So across his autobiographies, Douglass recounts asking himself a series of questions as a child, all of which include the central refrain, why am I a slave? And for reasons I explained in the book, Douglass's recollection and repetition of this specific question suggests its centrality to his outlook and directly interrogates the circumstances of his socially constructed identity. The act of asking, why am I a slave, establishes perspectival clarity that begins to expose the social dynamics governing his position as an individual with black skin, living in a particular historical context, geographic location, political economic frame, and social class. Following Douglass, by beginning our own political considerations with the question, why am I X, American, African, German, Indian, a man, woman, etc., inasmuch as our society assigns a particular value to such labels, can help us begin to see the advantages and limitations of our socially constructed positionality. Also central to the identity-aware approach that Douglass sanctions is his belief that an individual's experience as part of a particular group can be communicated and understood by people outside of the group who can then take positive political action or form coalitions based on this knowledge. Douglass consciously chose to compose his 3 autobiographies in ways that centered on his identity as a former slave. He also delivered thousands of speeches to audiences of different races and nationalities, where he invoked his experience. All this underscores his fundamental commitment to the principle of mutual intelligibility and, more importantly, his implicit belief in the possibility that progress can be achieved through the interchange of human experiences. So I'll conclude the section with this. In A Theory of Justice, John Rawls advances a thought experiment featuring an original position behind the veil of ignorance, under ideal circumstances that encourages questions such as, how might we establish a social system in which skin color doesn't matter? However, Douglass allowed for an identity-aware question with an alternative preamble. Given that we live in a society in which skin color continues to shape one's social outcomes, why am I a slave? Moreover, what might this condition mean for how I conceptualize political ideas and how I bring others to see the world from my perspective? Embracing an identity-aware frame that takes one's socially constructed position seriously allows us to avoid the pitfalls of identity-blind approaches that elide categorical differences, such as race or gender. It also frees us from the challenges of identity-driven solutions that can alienate potential allies outside of narrowly defined groups in diverse democracies. Furthermore, Douglass's identity-aware affirmation of mutual intelligibility recognizes that an individual can gain knowledge of another person and their socially constructed positionality by exchanging ideas. In this way, people can learn from perspectives held by those who are not like themselves. All told, an identity-aware approach promises to expand the boundaries of the big tent to allow for the passage of practical solutions to problems that can garner broad-based appeal. So today, I've shared a little bit about how American Dark Age, the forthcoming book, highlights the contributions of early African-American liberals to the American political tradition, where their status as equal contributors have long been overlooked. Moreover, I've shown how I've aimed to provide readers with a distinctive constellation of thinkers actively involved in creating political change through their criticism of the vestiges of feudalism, as they work to root out the causes of racial subordination and inequality through political processes grounded in liberal principles that inspired America's founding documents. They all recognize that while the arc of the moral universe is long, it did not necessarily bend toward justice without applying the pressure of political appeals and fostering public dialogue across stark lines of division. While much can be learned from what historian and political theorist Cedric Robinson labeled as the Black radical tradition, American Dark Age, which aims to give students and the general public an alternative framework, spotlights an early Black American Enlightenment tradition that tested, reformed, and ultimately embraced the promise of liberal ideas. Thank you.
We have 10 minutes.
No, we don't.
We have 5?
We have 20 minutes again.
Okay, great.
We're a little bit late, but 10 minutes is too few.
Anybody else with questions? 1, 2, 3. Okay, Susan goes first.
Thank you, Keidrick. I have all kinds of questions. I will try to ask just the shortest ones.
Sure.
I look forward to the book. When I was in the Deep South about 7 years ago doing some research on the way the South understands itself from various sides, I was told that all of those useless Greek columns on big houses all through the Cotton Belt were actually not only reference to feudalism, but to Greek slave society, and that people were very slave owners were very conscious of saying, look, this is where democracy was born in Athens, and we're telling you that this is a good thing. So that's question number one. Question number two, whether you see any references to that in your feudalist or anti-feudalist thinkers. So question number two, I have always wondered what Jefferson meant when he wrote, "I tremble when I think that God is just." And I wonder if you have thoughts about that. And finally, I really liked your trying to come up with a new sense of, using identity aware rather than the other two alternatives. But I wonder if you think this is not just about pragmatism, not alienating potential allies, which you talked about, and that's a good political point. I hate being called an ally. That is, I feel solidarity with people who act on the same principles that I do, and I wonder if that plays any role in your notion.
Thank you so much for these great questions, Susan. I'll start with the relationships to Greek culture. Part of the innovation part of the intervention that I was looking to make was in the historiography of American slavery, where the ideas that slave owners, especially the ones at the very top that own the most, enslaved people, there's a lot written about the relationship between their vision and the notion of Greek slavery, Roman slavery, so on and so forth. And so what I saw that was missing from it was the more immediate context that they described variously as feudalism or monarchy or aristocracy. And while many of the founding ideas also emerge from Greek and Roman sources, I began to see the distortions and perversions of those through the feudal context, which is why I focused on that in this text. When Jefferson says, "I tremble for the country when I realize that God is just," I find that to be a striking eruption of reference to something outside of his very tightly controlled empirical framework that he marshals throughout Notes on the State of Virginia. We go from learning about shipyards and the territory of Virginia, and then he begins talking about slavery, and then he's like, "Oh yeah, God is just," and I don't know what this means. So I explore that a little bit in the book as well in my chapter on Jefferson. And I think that it's important to recognize that Jefferson is a highly conflicted person. I'm not one of the people who says we should throw Jefferson out. He's central to the American founding. But I'm also a person who thinks that we should place Jefferson in conversation with some of the enslaved people to try to get to a sense of what an American liberal democracy might look like. And finally, there is a political pragmatism, absolutely, to thinking about an awareness of identity. And, allies, affiliates, I think any solidarity might even be comrades. There's many ways that it could be described, but rather than touching on those more cultural resonances of ally and allyship that we've seen proliferate, I more mean people who might be in solidarity with the same cause.
Thank you. Thank you for that talk. A lot to think about there, and I really enjoyed it. And unexpectedly, I'm actually picking up on a couple of elements of Susan's last question. So let's go to the Greeks, the Greco-Romans, and that other famously articulate slave, Epictetus. Epictetus was a Stoic, and his flavor of Stoicism is extremely universalist. If there was an ancient living philosophy that had claim to being, let's say, a broad church, allowing everyone in on equal footing, it would be Stoicism. There were probably Stoic women philosophers and this kind of thing. So Stoicism is strongly universalist, and in particular, each of us is our reason. And this is what each of us has, no matter how we're situated, and so on. So it sounds very much like some of the ideas from the Enlightenment. And if you've read Epictetus' discourses or his handbook, you simply cannot imagine him ever raising the question, why am I a slave? And I think that's really interesting. What is it that's changed by the time of Frederick Douglass that can be a question, and that can be a fruitful question, that is a question to ask at all? And partly I'm just curious about that. What's changed in outlook, and are these Enlightenment ideas, or are these empirical ideas, or other things? But I also wonder if it relates a bit to Susan's third question about being identity aware in one's thinking, how that's not just a pragmatic thing. How is this thinking that you do also epistemological in some sense, right? Picking up the best lessons from standpoint epistemology, that there is something fruitful to be learned by asking that question. Because Epictetus didn't think there was.
Fabulous questions. Thank you so much. That's really good. My initial response to what changes from Epictetus, I love Stoic philosophy. Oh my God, Seneca, yeah, yes, no, I love it. But I think the context of racial slavery in the United States, and Douglass looking out and seeing instances of liberty as practically expressed, and when he's playing with these little white children as he's running through the streets of Maryland, they're sharing food, changing ideas, and he recognizes that these children will all grow up and be in a completely separate space than I will. But we have the same love, the same desire, the same reason, the same ability to reckon with the world in which we live. What's the distinction here? Why is it that I am a slave? And so I think that's a type of question that comes from that can possibly only emerge from a society that's deeply racialized for him, and where racial slavery is the predominant framework for people to reckon with. I think, yeah, does that get to. Oh,
question, whether
yeah.
the idea is not just pragmatic.
Yeah.
And how does this feed into, or is it just pragmatic?
Yeah, no, there's I think to the extent that we read and understand Douglass as someone who's very concerned with the pragmatic abolition of slavery before 1865 and concerned with the mitigation and elimination of prejudice throughout the rest of his lifetime until he dies in 1895. His thinking is always simultaneously pragmatic and normative. So to the extent that we can understand the identity-aware approach as something that's deeply practical, Douglass also believed in the universality of humanness, what he calls humanness, and from that perspective, he absolutely believes that there's no bond, no division that can separate people. And I'll say, too, that on top of that, or underlying that, is also a theological dimension. Douglass and others said that they are what I call in the book a spiritually communitarian worldview. They see themselves and everyone else as constituting one blood. And so even on that level, too, beyond the pragmatic, the philosophical, there's also a theological register as well that I think Douglass is trying to wrestle with and work through. Thank you.
Hi, Keidrick. Thank you so much. So when you were describing the early black reformers, you brought out how that they saw the potential in the inconsistency between theory and praxis, right? Is it not on? They saw the inconsistency between theory and practice, but they didn't see it as a problem in and of itself. They saw the potential. Now today, it seems different, and what I'm trying to get at is what's different today, and what did they know that we've forgotten? So there's a kind of unease whenever we're confronted now with the discrepancy between theory and practice, almost as if it would somehow be easier to live with it if Thomas Jefferson had said, all white men are created equal, right? Because then at least there would be no inconsistency. And I got a sense of that unease, too, from Francisca's question from the last talk, right? The difference between the Enlightenment ideals that fed Karl Marx and that ultimately underpinned the GDR and the reality that they had. So today, the first reaction seems to be this unease, this concern, rather than seeing the potential to use the master's tools against the master, which seems like the early black reformers understood to do. And I mean, this is a kind of part philosophical question, part psychological question, or just how you understand the debate today, what's happening.
That's a really good question. Thank you. I don't want to get in trouble by saying things about some postmodern theory that could. Oh, not in here, not in here. Yes. So as I'm untenured, before. No, Dominic, that's actually a question at the heart of the book in so many ways. And as I was doing research on these early black writers and thinkers, I'm like, yeah, that's it. I served in the military for 8 years in the United States Air Force before this, and my dad served in the military for 28 years. And so growing up, I grew up near a military base. We were always very committed to the values of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, the saluting of the flag, all of that. So I was already bought in. When I left the military and entered academia, I entered a very different world where America as a concept and also the founding ideals were very much up for question and undermining and all of that. So I was like, okay, where can I find a philosophical center? So I turned to Enlightenment philosophy more broadly. Then as I was reading it, I was like, we're African Americans in this. Surely there's a long history of black thinkers who had reckoned with the ideas in the founding documents. And I didn't find much of anything. So then that became the topic of the dissertation, which will become the second book that I'm working on right now on the Black American Enlightenment. And so all that to say, I think what's changed now is a mindset that is very skeptical, very ironic, very challenging of any of sorts of forms of traditionalism that actually, not even traditionalism, forms of philosophy that actually see a lot of value in and that I think we need to work through rather than overturn. And I saw that same passion, that same feeling, that same reason that I saw in my dad's military service and that I saw with my fellow colleagues in the Air Force. I saw that anticipated by many of these black thinkers, so black antebellum thinkers. So in trying to draw that connection between present day folks and the past and present day ideology that's like forget the past and forget some of these foundational thinkers, forget the Enlightenment. I try to mend those bonds. And so hopefully this book will give people an opportunity to begin to rethink their stances on the early Enlightenment tradition, and by seeing it as more than just a tradition of people that were in Europe, but actually Black Americans were also thinking through the same ideas and discussing them and circulating them.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for reminding people, and people do need to be reminded of the universality of the Enlightenment from the get-go. That this was not something that came later. Yeah. But here's the problem. And I think that the third question from Susan and your response to the Seneca question, something just came into my head. Yeah. So let's imagine a meeting between Jefferson and Douglass. And what I'm suggesting is I tremble when I think of God, as good. It's actually asking the question from Jefferson that Douglass was asking, why am I a slave? And it has to do with a fundamental tenet of the Enlightenment. And thank you for bringing the Jefferson, because people often, especially so-called nativists, black identity theorists and all that stuff, they don't pay attention to the fact that that was a cruel moment of self-awareness on the part of Jefferson, where he had to acknowledge to himself, something about this doesn't strike me as right. And it's exactly the same for Douglass. This is a society that proclaims universality, equality of all. So why am I a slave in this society? And the obverse of that is Jefferson saying, why am I a slave owner in this society? Thank you.
We should take the last question too.
Yes.
Keidrick
Yeah, just 1 minute. Last question.
Thank you, Keidrick, for a very careful talk. And it's nice to see, especially in that last section, that historians are being very careful with something that other historians are seeing as very self-evident, which I think perhaps we'll get to a future someday where we don't have to lay all the identities we have on the table before we say something. So one question that I have is more polemical, and
Sure.
the other is kind of just what your opinion is. So I'll start with the second, and I'll be as short as possible. Sure. To what extent does the kind of work that you're doing fit into the 1619 Project? And what are your views on that project? It's controversial, but and I have some views of my own, but I'm interested to hear what you think. Second, I can't help but thinking about how the word abolition on the other side of the Atlantic at that time means something very different. And how I think Ken and Mullick wrote this great book in the late 90s called The Meaning of Race, and talks about how it was perfectly legible for abolitionists to also be eugenicists. And so I think what I'm asking is how some of the material, when you were writing this book up, did you find certain elements that couldn't go into this book, that perhaps need another book because they don't necessarily follow a certain pattern or they diverge? But great talk, really fascinating stuff, wonderful.
Thank you for these great questions. I'll answer the second question. Y'all are trying to get me like canceled or fired. No. So on to the much easier question about the eugenicists. So in the very first paragraph of the book, I really try to lay out how racial feudalism is one lens that we can use to try to get an understanding of what's happening. Because scientific racism is on the rise in the mid-19th century. The Greek and Roman influences of slavery are present. But what I hadn't seen as clearly reckoned with was the feudal connections, which I think have a lot of merit, especially when we think about the relationship between feudalism and an Enlightenment liberal project, and how the cross currents of the transition between each it's occurring in Europe, and it happens in the United States as well, but in more subtle ways that I'm trying to unearth. I answered a question at a previous talk about the 1619 Project in a very careful way, and I'm wishing I had the, the transcripts.
You really don't have to.
Yes. No, it's so one of the things that I've been very interested in is the idea of an origin story, or what that actually means for the country. And in my view, so many of the, and I can't speak to it from my perspective, but I will from the perspective of these antebellum Black thinkers. They were very interested in 1776 and what the Declaration of Independence meant there and then. There's a man named Lemuel Haynes who was he's a veteran as well. He former indentured servant, Black indentured servant. And once the Declaration of Independence emerges, July 4th, a few months later, Lemuel Haynes writes a long document in that both celebrates the ideals of the Declaration, but also puts pressure on them and demonstrates its shortcomings. And so I see that instance as the spark that began this broader Black Enlightenment tradition that's very much in conversation with that date and that time period. So in as much as how current historians and journalists want to reframe the beginning of the United States, I can't speak as much to that, but what I can speak to is how a lot of these, the thinkers that I've been working with and studying and sitting with were very, very committed to the 1776 and and then the Constitution, which was ratified in 1789. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keidrick.